Early winter. Night falls fast over a snow-buried farm outside Cedar Ridge. A former U.S. Marine and his aging canine believe the storm will keep the world away until morning. But before midnight, the blizzard carries news from a flickering TV. A female police officer vanished on a frozen back road. Hours later, as snow thickens and the wind sharpens, the dog rises, rigid, staring toward the dark tree line. What waits out there isn't chance, and dawn is running out. The rope, the cold, the silence are only the beginning. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, please subscribe for more stories of loyalty, faith, and courage. Snow fell steadily over Cedar Ridge, quiet and unhurried, turning roads to white scars and the surrounding mountains into shadowed walls, as winter tightened its grip on the small Montana town. Ethan Walker arrived at the farm just after dawn, the sky the color of cold steel. At 42, he carried himself with the stillness of someone who had learned, long ago, that unnecessary movement invited trouble. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a frame hardened by years of military service rather than gym polish. His dark brown hair was cropped short and already threaded with gray at the temples, his jaw angular, marked by a faint scar running from the edge of his beard line toward his chin. He kept his beard trimmed close, more out of habit than style, and his eyes, an unremarkable gray to most, rarely lingered on anything for long. People in town remembered him as polite but distant, the kind of man who nodded instead of waved, who listened more than he spoke. The Marine Corps had taught him discipline, but loss had taught him restraint. Years earlier, a mission gone wrong had taken 2 men under his command, and since then, Ethan had learned to keep the world at arm's length. The farm itself was older than he was, a weather-beaten wooden house surrounded by fields now buried beneath snow. It had belonged to his grandfather, Henry Walker, a man who had worked the land until his hands stiffened and his back curved with age. Ethan had not planned to keep the property. He had come only to sign papers, settle affairs, and leave before winter made the roads impassable. That intention felt solid when he unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and breathed in the smell of cold wood, old iron, and dust that had not yet learned his name. Inside, the kitchen was dim and cold. Ethan set his bag down, shrugged out of his jacket, and turned on the television more for noise than interest. The local morning news flickered to life, the anchor's voice calm in a way that felt rehearsed. A photograph appeared on the screen, a young woman in a police uniform, dark blonde hair pulled neatly back, eyes alert and steady. The caption read, "Officer Emily Carter, missing." The anchor explained that Officer Carter had disappeared the previous night while investigating a vehicle abandoned on a secondary road more than 20 miles outside Cedar Ridge, an area now inaccessible due to the worsening snowstorm. Search efforts were delayed until conditions improved. Ethan paused, one hand resting on the back of a wooden chair. Emily Carter. He did not know her personally, but he had seen her around town before. Mid-30s, average height, athletic build, the posture of someone accustomed to authority without arrogance. People spoke of her as competent and fair, someone who took her work seriously without losing her humanity. What unsettled Ethan was not her face, but the location mentioned. The road in question cut across the forest bordering the northern edge of his grandfather's land. It was a forgotten route, used mostly by hunters and locals who knew better than to rely on it in winter. He told himself it was coincidence, yet the timing pressed against his thoughts like a dull ache. A low sound drew his attention away from the screen. Ranger had risen from his place near the door. The German Shepherd was nearly 8 years old now, his muzzle dusted with gray, his sable coat thick and well kept. Ranger's body still carried the powerful lines of a working dog, deep chest, strong hind legs, but his movements were calmer than they once had been. Trained as a canine during Ethan's service, Ranger was disciplined, alert, and quietly protective. He did not bark without reason. He did not panic. He simply watched, and when he moved, it was because something had crossed an invisible line. Ethan trusted that instinct more than he trusted most people. Throughout the day, snow thickened and the wind picked up. Ethan busied himself with practical tasks, checking the generator, stacking firewood, making sure the fences had not collapsed under the weight of ice. He told himself he was preparing the house to sell, not settling in. Yet when night came, he cooked a simple meal, fed Ranger, and sat in the quiet as if the place expected him to stay. The news replayed the report about Officer Carter. No new information, no progress. The storm was to blame. Near midnight, Ethan turned off the lights and headed toward the bedroom. That was when Ranger stood abruptly, his body going rigid. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud, but unmistakable. His ears angled forward, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the northern fence line. Ethan stopped, every sense sharpening. Ranger did not react to wildlife with this kind of focus. Whatever had drawn his attention was unfamiliar, deliberate. Ethan reached for his jacket and flashlight, his movements controlled. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, snow whipping sideways, erasing distance and sound. Ranger moved to the door, waiting, muscles tense but obedient. As Ethan stepped onto the porch, the night swallowed the light almost immediately. Then, through the roar of the storm, something else cut through. A faint, sharp sound, metal striking metal, brief and unmistakably out of place, echoing from the forest beyond the farm. Ethan followed Ranger beyond the porch light and into the open field, the wind cutting sideways as snow stung his face like grit. The storm had intensified, but not long enough to erase what had happened here. Ranger moved with deliberate purpose, head low, nose working the air rather than the ground, his gait smooth and unhurried. The dog's training showed in the way he filtered chaos, ignoring deer trails, dismissing old scents, focusing only on what was fresh. Ethan matched his pace, boots crunching softly, flashlight angled low to avoid scattering shadows that could mask detail. He had learned overseas that haste created noise, and noise invited mistakes. They reached the fence line on the north side of the property, where the land dipped toward the forest. The barbed wire sagged unnaturally between two posts. Ethan knelt, gloved fingers brushing snow aside. The wire had been pulled hard, not cut, leaving a bend that spoke of force applied quickly and without care. Ranger paused, nostrils flaring, then moved along the fence toward a darker patch where the snow was disturbed. Ethan followed and saw it, parallel grooves cutting away from the dirt track that bordered the woods. Tire marks. Not the clean arcs of a controlled turn, but a slanted slide that suggested speed and panic. The kind of correction made by someone who hadn't expected the road to vanish under ice. Ranger stopped again, this time lifting his head, ears forward. Ethan swept the light wider. Near the tracks, a torn scrap of fabric clung to the wire, dark blue-green against the white, its fibers frayed as if ripped by a sudden pull. Ethan pinched it between his fingers. The cloth was heavy-duty, uniform grade, not the kind worn by hunters or farmers. His jaw tightened. He didn't need the television to tell him what that color meant. They moved downslope, the wind quieter among the trees. Ranger's nose traced an invisible line, pausing at places where the snow held faint impressions. Boots that had slipped, then corrected, the stride uneven. Ethan noticed how Ranger ignored older animal tracks, bypassed them without hesitation, and lingered only where the scent sharpened. Oil. Metal. And beneath it all, something else, thin and unsettling. Blood, diluted and faint, carried by cold air. At the edge of a shallow ditch, Ranger halted and sat, a signal Ethan recognized. He stepped closer and saw a small object half buried in snow, its metal catching the beam. Ethan dug it free with careful fingers. The badge was intact, but for a broken clasp, the name engraved cleanly across the front. Emily Carter. The weight of it settled into his palm, heavier than it should have been. This wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't a news segment or a rumor passed over coffee. The boundary between his land and the world beyond it had been crossed, and with it, whatever distance he had tried to keep from trouble. Ethan straightened, scanning the trees. The forest pressed close, branches bent under snow, 1,000 dark corridors opening and closing as the wind shifted. He thought of Emily Carter as he had seen her in town. Upright posture, calm eyes, a voice steady even when people raised theirs. She wasn't reckless. If she'd left her vehicle, it was because she believed she had control of the situation. That belief had been wrong, and now the cost of that mistake lay scattered across his grandfather's land. Ranger moved again, leading toward a narrow game trail that cut deeper into the woods. The dog's body language had changed, muscles coiled, tail low, steps shorter. He wasn't tracking what had been left behind. He was measuring what might still be ahead. Ethan adjusted his grip on the flashlight and slowed further, every sense tuned to the space beyond the beam. The night offered no clear sounds beyond the storm, but silence itself could be a warning. He had learned to respect that in places where the quiet broke only when something went wrong. They reached a stand of pines where the snow thinned beneath the branches. There, Ranger stopped so abruptly, Ethan nearly collided with him. The dog's hackles rose, a low growl vibrating in his chest, controlled but urgent. Ranger's head lifted, scenting the air rather than the ground now, eyes fixed on a point Ethan couldn't see. Ethan followed the line of his gaze and felt the hair at the back of his neck prickle. The air carried warmth not explained by the wind, the lingering presence of people who had not gone far. Ethan shut off the flashlight and waited. In the darkness he listened, not for footsteps, but for rhythm, for the subtle irregularities that marked human movement. Nothing revealed itself. Yet Ranger did not relax. He remained still, a living warning, telling Ethan without words that the trail was not cold. Whatever had dragged, driven, or carried Emily Carter away had done so recently. Close enough to matter. Close enough to change the shape of the night. Ethan exhaled slowly. The choice in front of him was narrowing. He could turn back, call this in when daylight came, and hope the storm hadn't buried what little they had. Or he could keep moving, guided by a dog who had never once failed him when it counted. He glanced at the badge in his hand, then tucked it safely into his pocket. The cold bit deeper as he stepped forward, Ranger rising beside him, the forest swallowing them both as the storm pressed on. Ranger led Ethan off the narrow game trail and down into a shallow depression where the wind lost its teeth. The forest grew denser here, pines and firs closing in until the snow lay thinner beneath their branches, broken only by fallen needles and frozen earth. Ethan felt it before he saw it, the subtle change in air, warmer, heavier, carrying the unmistakable scent of human fear and blood dulled by cold. Ranger slowed, steps careful now, as if approaching something fragile rather than dangerous. The hollow revealed itself gradually. It was no more than a natural dip in the land near a dry creek bed, shielded from the worst of the storm by rock and root. There, half curled against the earth, lay a woman. Her wrists were bound with plastic ties, her ankles crossed and secured, her mouth sealed with a strip of gray duct tape. Snow clung to her jacket and hair, but her breathing was shallow and uneven, fogging faintly in the cold. Emily Carter was smaller up close than Ethan had expected, perhaps mid-30s, with an athletic build now betrayed by weakness. Her dark blonde hair had slipped loose from its tie and tangled against her cheeks, strands stiff with frost. Her skin was pale to the point of blue around the lips, the exposed edge of her neck mottled where cold had begun to take hold. Even unconscious, her posture spoke of resistance, shoulders tense, muscles unwilling to surrender completely. This was not a woman who gave up easily. Ethan dropped to one knee beside her without hesitation. Years fell away as training took over, each movement precise, economical. He cut the bindings at her wrists first, then her ankles, careful not to jostle her too much. Ranger lay down immediately on her other side, pressing his thick, sable-furred body against her back. The dog was nearly 8 years old, his strength tempered by age but not diminished by it. His warmth was immediate, deliberate. Ethan peeled the tape from Emily's mouth slowly to avoid tearing skin already raw from cold. Her eyes fluttered open with effort, pupils struggling to focus. She inhaled sharply, a breath caught halfway between panic and relief. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "You're safe for the moment. Don't try to move." He slipped his jacket off and draped it over her shoulders, adding a wool scarf from his pocket to insulate her neck. He checked her pulse, weak but present, and rubbed her hands briskly to coax circulation back without shocking her system. Emily tried to speak, failed, then swallowed and tried again. Her voice came out hoarse, scraped thin by cold and fear. "They didn't take me for money," she coughed, eyes squeezing shut for a moment. Ethan nodded, encouraging without interrupting. Ranger shifted slightly, adjusting his weight to block the wind more fully. "It was a trade," Emily continued, words uneven but determined. "They want someone released. I don't know all the names, but it's not ransom." She shivered hard, despite the layers now covering her. Ethan felt the tension settle deeper in his chest. This wasn't opportunistic violence. It was calculated. "How long?" he asked quietly. Emily's gaze drifted toward the treetops, where the storm pressed against the branches. "Before dawn," she said. "That's all they said. Before the light comes." Her fingers twitched weakly against his sleeve, as if grounding herself in something real. "They're not gone. They stayed close, watching." She swallowed again, forcing the words out. "If they hear engines, voices, anything loud, they won't hesitate." Ethan absorbed that without visible reaction, though his mind moved fast. Calling for help now would be the wrong move. Noise traveled unpredictably in snow, and fear made men cruel. He adjusted Emily's position slightly, checking her boots. One was missing, sock soaked and stiff with ice. Hypothermia was no longer a threat. It was already present. "You did good," he said simply. "Staying alive out here isn't easy." It was not praise offered lightly. It was acknowledgement between people who understood the cost of endurance. Emily's eyes flicked to Ranger, then back to Ethan. "Your dog," she murmured. "He didn't make a sound." There was a faint note of wonder there, even now. Ranger's ears twitched at her voice, but he remained still, focused on his task. Before Ethan could respond, Ranger's body stiffened. His head snapped up, ears forward, a low growl rolling from his chest, deeper, sharper than before. It wasn't a warning meant to scare. It was a signal meant for Ethan alone. Ranger's hackles rose as he turned his gaze toward the tree line above the hollow. Ethan froze, listening. At first there was only the wind and the soft hiss of falling snow. Then, faint but distinct, came the sound of movement not in rhythm with the storm, a foot sliding against frozen ground, corrected too quickly. Human, close enough to matter. Ethan killed his flashlight instinctively, plunging them into deeper shadow. Emily's breath hitched as she followed his eyes, understanding dawning through exhaustion. Her fingers tightened in the fabric of his sleeve. Ranger shifted from a source of warmth to a barrier, placing his body subtly between Emily and the dark beyond the hollow. "They're still here," Ethan said under his breath. Not a question, but a fact. The forest seemed to lean inward, holding its breath along with them. Whatever choices lay ahead would need to be made fast, and none of them would be simple. Ethan didn't need more time to understand the shape of the trap. He only needed enough silence to decide how to step into it. Ranger's warning still hung in the air, and Emily's shallow breathing told him the margin was already thin. Bringing her back to the farmhouse would paint a straight line through the snow for anyone with patience, and calling for rescue would fracture the night with sound that carried farther than lights ever could. He had learned, long before Cedar Ridge, that the loudest choice was rarely the safest. He glanced at Emily, noting the tremor in her hands, the tight set of her jaw as she fought to stay present. She was tough, mid-30s, trained, disciplined, but hypothermia dulled resolve, and time was the enemy now. Ethan chose the option that cost him the most and bought her the most: separation. He guided Emily and Ranger along a short traverse to a cleft in the rock where the hillside folded inward, a narrow ravine shielded from wind by stone ribs and snow-laden brush. The place smelled of cold granite and pine sap, dry enough to keep the worst of the storm off her skin. Ethan knelt and arranged her carefully, checking circulation again, easing her back against the rock, then stripping his jacket and laying it over her like a promise he meant to keep. He pressed his knife into her palm, handle first, then set his flashlight where Ranger could nudge it if needed. Ranger, sable coat dark against the stone, lowered himself beside Emily, broad chest rising slow and steady, eyes alert but calm. Ethan met the dog's gaze and gave a single, precise command he hadn't used in years, a word that meant hold, protect, do not move unless the world ends. Ranger's tail stilled. The command took. Emily caught Ethan's sleeve as he rose. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was iron. "You don't have to," she started, the sentence breaking apart. Ethan leaned close, his voice barely more than breath. "I do. Stay quiet. Trust him." He tapped Ranger's shoulder once, a ritual older than words, then stepped back into the trees before doubt could slow him. He made his trail loud on purpose. Boots scuffed wide arcs, heels biting ice, a clumsy rhythm that spoke of haste and fear. He flashed the light in uneven bursts, letting it cut through branches and bounce off trunks, then killed it and moved again, counting steps, measuring distance. Years ago, in places with names he no longer spoke aloud, he had learned how men followed what they wanted to believe. He gave them what they wanted. Snow swallowed his prints quickly, but not all at once. He left enough to be read by anyone patient enough to read them. The forest tightened around him. He angled downslope, then doubled back, then climbed again, changing cadence to break the story his tracks told. When he stopped, it was because the night shifted. Not sound, but pressure. The way air gathers when someone else is deciding. He heard it then. A murmur carried low, words pressed tight to keep them from traveling. The men stayed out of sight, but their presence had a weight to it. One voice, rough and confident, cut through the rest. The speaker was tall by the sound of him, steps long and measured, the kind of man who let others rush ahead while he counted. Ethan pictured a face he hadn't seen yet. Late 30s, weathered. Beard kept short to avoid snagging, eyes narrowed by years of mistrust. He imagined a past that had trained him to read patterns and a presence that had taught him to exploit them. "He's not local," the man murmured, close enough now that Ethan could hear the scrape of breath in his throat. "Too clean, too calm." Another voice laughed softly, younger, reckless, the sound of someone who had never paid the full price of a mistake. The leader shushed him with a sound that meant obedience had been learned the hard way. Ethan moved again, letting a branch snap under his boot. letting the light flare once more. He counted heartbeats, then slid sideways, placing his foot where the wind had scoured the snow thin. The first shot cracked the night open. The report echoed off stone and tree, a hard punctuation that sent birds exploding from branches and pain singing along Ethan's ribs as a splinter tore his sleeve. He dropped and rolled, breath held, body remembering angles and timing his mind refused to forget. Another shot followed, closer, chewing bark where his shoulder had been a moment before. He ran, not straight, not fast, but smart, using the slope to hide his speed, letting gravity sell the lie of panic. The men pursued, boots breaking rhythm now, their discipline thinning under adrenaline. Ethan slipped through a stand of young pines, ducked beneath a fallen log, then climbed, lungs burning, snow packing his boots. He stopped where the wind roared loudest and cut left, leaving a false trail that climbed into nothing. When he finally slowed, it was because the forest let him. He listened until the shouts fell back into the storm, until the night resumed its indifferent breathing. Ethan leaned against a trunk and closed his eyes for a count of 10, feeling the ache bloom where fear had tried to take hold. The choice had worked, for now. Somewhere behind him, Emily lay quiet, beneath stone and fir, protected by a dog who understood orders better than promises. Ethan turned back the way he hadn't come, steps light off, the snow erasing him as if he had never been there. Ethan circled back through the timber the way water finds a crack, quiet, patient, refusing the paths that looked easy. The shots were behind him now, swallowed by distance and snow, but adrenaline still hummed under his skin. When the rock ribs of the ravine came into view, he slowed to a crawl. Ranger lifted his head first, eyes catching the faintest movement. The dog did not bark. Emily was still there, curled against the stone, Ethan's jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. She was breathing, but the sound had changed, thinner, more fragile, each inhale a negotiation with the cold. He knelt and checked her again. Her hands were colder than before, the skin pale and waxed at the edges, nails faintly blue. Ranger pressed closer, sharing heat, his steady presence the only constant in a night that refused to settle. Ethan murmured to Emily, not for reassurance, but to keep her tethered. She answered with a nod that cost her effort. When she spoke, it was with the economy of someone who knew there was little left to spare. "If it's light," she said, eyes half-lidded, breath fogging weakly, "they won't need me anymore." The meaning landed hard. Dawn was not rescue. Dawn was a deadline. Ethan felt time compress around them, every choice narrowing to a point that cut. He pulled his phone and angled it toward the sky. One bar flickered, then vanished. He climbed a few steps, tried again, the screen lighting his face and nothing else. The storm bent the signal until it snapped. Calling now would be an act of faith without evidence. He shut the phone down to save what little battery remained and let the night reclaim its darkness. Ethan's mind went where it always did under pressure, backward, then forward. He remembered his grandfather, Henry Walker, not as a frail old man, but as a younger version of endurance, tall and spare, hands permanently marked by work, eyes a pale blue that missed nothing. Henry had taught him the land with a patience that came from living alone long enough to know what mattered. One winter evening, years ago, as snow had walled the house in, Henry had pointed toward the high ridge behind the farm and said, matter of fact, "When the storm meets the valley, the hill still sees." He'd shown Ethan the place then, a bald shoulder of rock where the wind scoured clean, and the town's lights sometimes glimmered like a promise through weather that broke everything else. Ethan looked up through the trees. The ridge was a dark mass against darker sky, its line just visible where branches thinned. It was higher ground, more exposed, and harder with an injured person. but it was also the only place that might speak to the world beyond the storm. He weighed the risk with the same clarity he'd learned to use when men's lives depended on minutes. Staying hidden bought silence, not survival. Moving bought a chance. "We're going up," he told Emily, voice steady. He didn't ask. He adjusted her scarf, checked Ranger's harness, then slid an arm behind Emily's shoulders, lifting her with care. She was lighter than he expected, all muscle and resolve reduced by cold to something that felt breakable. Ranger rose immediately, flanking them, eyes scanning, body alert without tension. They moved slowly, step by step, the slope stealing breath and strength. Ethan chose lines that sheltered them from wind, pausing when Emily shivered too hard, forcing circulation back with gentle pressure. He counted time by Ranger's breaths and his own pulse. Halfway up, Emily's head tipped against his shoulder. "My radio," she whispered. "They took it. And my boot." He nodded. Facts mattered. He tucked the knowledge away. The trees thinned as they climbed. Wind found them and tried to pry them apart, snow lashing sideways, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. Ethan kept moving, angling his body to shield Emily, Ranger leaning into the weather like a living wedge. At the edge of the rock shoulder, the world opened. Below, the valley was a white void. Above, the storm roared. But through it, faint, distant, were pinpricks of amber, the town's lights blinking like a code he could almost read. Ethan set Emily down against the stone, out of the worst of the wind, and pulled his phone again. One bar flared, died. He cursed softly and scanned for anything reflective. The old trick might still work. He searched his pockets and found the small steel mirror Henry had once used to check the backs of his hands for frostbite. Ethan angled it, testing, catching nothing but gray. He needed elevation and timing. He needed minutes he didn't have. Ranger stiffened. Not a growl this time, worse. His ears pinned forward, body aligning toward the opposite slope. Ethan followed the line of the dog's gaze and felt his chest tighten. Down the far side of the hill, 3 points of light moved upward in staggered rhythm, cutting through snow with intention. Flashlights. Human. Close enough now that the storm couldn't hide them. Ethan killed his phone and pressed his palm to the cold stone, grounding himself. The clock was almost done pretending it wasn't ticking. He pulled Emily closer to the rock, whispering calm into her hair, and set his feet, choosing angles, distances, the order of things. Across the hill, the lights climbed, patient and sure, answering the choice he'd made with one of their own. The hilltop offered no mercy. Wind stripped it bare, scouring the rock until it gleamed dark and wet beneath the snow. And the cold there was sharper, cleaner, the kind that punished hesitation. Ethan felt it immediately as he rose to his feet, setting his body between Emily and the open slope. Below them, the valley was erased, but the distant glow of Cedar Ridge still pulsed faintly through the storm, a fragile constellation clinging to the earth. Time had narrowed to seconds now, each one loud in his head. Ethan moved with purpose, breaking dead pine branches from a twisted tree that clung stubbornly to the rock. He piled them low, shielding the stack with his body, then struck his lighter. The flame faltered, then caught. Wet needles hissed and smoldered, releasing a thick, gray smoke that curled upward and immediately bent sideways in the wind. It wasn't fire he needed. It was visibility. A signal that said someone was still alive up here, someone worth finding. Emily, pale and shaking but conscious, forced herself upright. Her face was sharp-boned and bloodless in the cold, dark hair plastered to her temples, but her eyes were still clear. She pulled the small steel mirror from Ethan's pocket and angled it toward the valley, adjusting by instinct more than sight. She had grown up in this kind of work. 35 years old, disciplined, stubborn. A patrol officer who volunteered for the roads no one else wanted. That stubbornness kept her hand steady now as she caught the distant glow of town lights and flashed it in controlled bursts, a silent rhythm against the storm. The sound came before the sight. A low thudding, uneven at first, then steadier, the air itself beginning to vibrate. Ethan's chest tightened as he recognized it. Rotors. Far off, but real. He didn't let himself believe yet. Hope could be as dangerous as fear. Ranger stood slightly downhill, body angled outward, snow collecting on his sable coat. 7 years old, heavy-chested and powerful, the German Shepherd's scarred ear twitched as he tracked movement below. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He waited, muscles coiled, eyes burning with quiet intelligence. Ranger had been trained not just to attack, but to choose, to disable without killing when ordered. That training had been bought with blood, and Ethan trusted it with his life. The flashlights broke from the tree line moments later. 3 men emerged onto the slope, wind flattening their jackets against their frames. The leader stepped forward first, tall and broad-shouldered, beard rimed with frost, eyes hard beneath a knit cap pulled low. His name, Ethan would later learn, was Mark Harlan, a man shaped by years of small crimes and one very large failure that had turned caution into cruelty. Tonight, his patience was gone. "Easy," Harlan called, voice carrying through the wind. "We just want the girl." One of the others surged ahead. Younger, thinner, jittery, his movements too fast, panic leaking through bravado. He reached Emily first, arms snaking around her shoulders, a hunting knife flashing into view. The blade pressed under her jaw, close enough to draw a thin line of blood that froze almost instantly. Ranger moved. He launched uphill in a blur of black and tan, jaws snapping shut not on flesh, but on the man's wrist. Bone cracked. The knife fell. Ranger twisted, using his weight and momentum, locking the arm while keeping his teeth controlled, exactly as trained. The man screamed and collapsed, Emily stumbling free as Ranger shoved the threat away with a forceful shoulder. Ethan didn't think. He closed the distance on Harlan in 3 strides. The leader swung first, a heavy punch meant to end it fast. But Ethan slipped inside it, years of Marine Corps training guiding his body without permission. He drove an elbow into Harlan's ribs, felt something give, then swept his legs. They hit the rock hard. Harlan tried to rise, but Ethan was already there, knee pinning him down, fist stopping an inch from his face. "Don't," Ethan said quietly. The third man bolted, turning and running downslope, disappearing into the snow-choked trees before Ranger could be recalled. Ethan registered it distantly. Later. There would be a later for that. The helicopter broke through the cloud ceiling then, its searchlight slicing the darkness open. White light flooded the hilltop, flattening shadows, freezing the scene in stark clarity. Smoke curling, Ranger standing over a fallen man, Emily sagging against the rock, Ethan kneeling, breath steaming. A voice boomed from above, distorted but unmistakably official. "This is search and rescue. Do not move." Ethan raised his hands slowly. Emily laughed once, a broken sound that turned into a sob as the adrenaline drained away. Ranger returned to Ethan's side, sitting when commanded, eyes never leaving the tree line where the third man had vanished. As rescuers spilled onto the hill, wrapping Emily in thermal blankets, securing the suspects, Ethan looked once more toward the forest. Somewhere out there, someone had escaped. The hill had given them everything it could. What remained would follow them down. Snow fell differently after everything ended. Softer, slower, as if the land itself had decided the storm had said enough. Ethan stood on the ridge road weeks later, watching rescue trucks descend toward Cedar Ridge, their tire tracks cutting clean lines where chaos had once ruled. Emily had survived. That fact still felt unreal some mornings, like a truth that needed to be touched to be believed. The doctors called it a close margin, minutes, not hours, but she recovered with the same stubborn resolve that had kept her alive on the hill. Most of the men were in custody now. Mark Harlan and the younger accomplice faced charges that would likely bury them for decades. But the third man, the one who ran, had not vanished without consequence. Under questioning, Harlan had talked. Not out of remorse, but out of calculation. The kidnapping, he admitted, had never been about Emily alone. She had been leverage, a piece in a wider operation trafficking stolen vehicles and moving contraband through forgotten back roads during winter storms, when roads closed and eyes turned away. Cedar Ridge was just one node. The escapee had been a courier, a runner who knew routes deeper into the mountains. The investigation widened quietly, like a crack spreading beneath ice. Ethan listened to the updates from a distance. He gave his statement, answered what he could, then returned to the farm and let the rest move without him. Fame found him anyway. Local news, questions he didn't want to answer. The word hero applied where he felt only responsibility. He declined interviews. He fixed fences. He split wood. Ranger followed him everywhere, the dog's presence steady and grounding. 7 years of shared discipline now softened by peace. The scar on Ranger's ear caught the light when he lifted his head, a reminder that survival always left a mark. Emily came back in early spring, when the snow thinned to patches and the ground began to breathe again. She arrived alone, driving an unmarked pickup, no uniform, no badge on her chest. She looked different out of context, still lean and sharp-featured, but with color back in her skin, and a quietness that suggested choice rather than command. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, no longer tucked beneath a winter cap, and she moved with care, as if listening to her body before asking it for anything. They sat at the old kitchen table where Ethan had watched the news the morning she disappeared. Sunlight warmed the wood now. Emily set a small object between them, a piece of metal, rectangular and worn smooth at the edges, engraved with careful hands. No one left behind. She slid it toward him without ceremony. "I'm taking leave," she said, meeting his eyes. "Maybe longer than leave." Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. "I need to decide who I am without a radio telling me where to stand." Ethan nodded. He understood that kind of reckoning. He told her he wasn't selling the farm after all. The words felt settled, final, like a decision that had been waiting years for him to arrive. He realized then that his grandfather hadn't left him land to escape the world, but a place to meet it when it came broken and cold. A high ridge to see from, a shelter to stand firm in. The inheritance wasn't the house or the acres, it was the role. They walked the perimeter together before Emily left, Ranger trotting ahead, nose busy with spring. She didn't ask to stay. He didn't ask her to. Some bonds didn't need promises to hold. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch as dusk settled. Ranger lay at his feet, chin on his paws, eyes half closed in contentment. Snowflakes drifted down again, light as ash, catching on the railing before melting away. Far off, the lights of Cedar Ridge flickered to life, small and steady against the dark. Ethan watched them without urgency. Tomorrow would bring work, and maybe trouble, and maybe another storm. For the first time since he'd returned, he didn't feel the pull to leave. The snow remembered what had happened here. So did he. And when the next call came, because it always did, this place would be ready. Sometimes the miracle is not the storm stopping, but the strength God places in ordinary hearts when the storm refuses to end. On a cold hill in the snow, no angels appeared in the sky, only a man who chose not to walk away, a dog who obeyed without fear, and a life that was saved because someone believed they were not alone. God often works this way in our daily lives too, through quiet courage, through compassion when it costs us comfort, through standing firm when the world tells us to leave. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to support stories that remind us of faith, courage, and grace. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you through every storm you face.